Welcome back, friends. Tonight we're traveling to the magical forests of Madagascar, but don't worry, you won't need to pack a bag or learn how to leap from tree to tree like a lemur. I'll do all the jumping for you, so make yourself comfortable, pull up a blanket, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. That way you'll never miss a single adventure. Now, sit back, relax, and let's drift into the gentle, curious world of the lemur. In the forests of Madagascar, there once lived lemurs the size of giant apes, and now they're gone. The reasons why aren't loud or dramatic. They're subtle, like the rustle of leaves at night. In this gentle journey, I'll show you the ancient world they came from, how isolation shaped them into creatures found nowhere else, and the quiet changes that broke that spell. Keep listening, and that gap between the lemurs of the past and the lemurs of today will seem almost stranger than fiction. How does a lemur even get here in the first place? By the time the first of their kind set foot on Madagascar, the island had already been off on its own for an absurdly long stretch of time. We're talking tens of millions of years since it peeled away from the last bits of Gondwana. If you pull back far enough on a map of deep time, you'd see the landmass drifting like a raft itself, breaking off from Africa and floating eastward into the Indian Ocean until it just stopped. That distance isn't something an animal could simply stroll across. It's hundreds of kilometers of open water, salt water, the sort of blue nothing you don't return from without wings or a very sturdy boat. And lemurs had neither. The separation wasn't quick. It was a slow sundering of continents that started when Gondwana fractured, sending Madagascar and the Indian subcontinent adrift. India kept moving. Madagascar parked itself south of the equator and stayed put. By the time primates evolved on the mainland, the island was already far enough away you wouldn't even see it through haze on the horizon, even if you could somehow climb high enough to look. So, imagine it. Africa with its forests full of monkeys, prosimians, and other creatures, and off to one side, an empty stage of habitats waiting for an actor that wouldn't arrive for millions of years. That's the part that makes the story so strange. Madagascar was not a stop on anyone's migration route. It wasn't like you could hop from island to island picking up coconuts along the way. There wasn't an along the way at all. The gap between the mainland primates and the lemurs of Madagascar isn't just geographic, it's evolutionary. You don't see a chain of half-lemur cousins on islands in between, because there were no islands. The space between them was simply water, and water is the most effective barrier nature has ever devised for a land animal, and yet, somehow, they came. The main theory is as improbable as it sounds. Picture a stretch of African coast during a storm so fierce it rips apart trees, soil, and underbrush, sending them sliding into a swollen river. The debris builds into a tangled mass, roots, branches, fallen logs, maybe even whole trees. Then the flood pushes it out into the ocean. The strange part is sometimes these mats float, not for hours, for days, maybe weeks. Small animals trapped or hiding in the tangle end up traveling with it. Most of the time, the story ends right there, with a storm-scattered raft breaking apart and sinking long before anywhere useful is reached. But every now and then, conditions line up in a way that bends probability until it almost snaps. Favorable currents, calm spells between storms, a starting point close enough, and an end point that just happens to be in the right direction. You might think of it as winning a lottery where the prize is accidentally colonizing a whole island. For a primate the size of a squirrel, clinging to branches in hungry confusion, that's all it took. Once that raft scraped up against Madagascar's shore, its passengers had reached a place where they would never have to share the stage with another monkey, ape, or tarsier again. Oceanic crossings like that are rare beyond belief. There's nothing in the ordinary behavior of most animals that could prepare them to survive one. The salt air alone can kill delicate plants. Many mammal species just wouldn't make it. Too big, too dependent on regular feeding, too poorly equipped to drink rainwater from leaves. And yet the lemur ancestors managed it. Whether it was sheer endurance, the right mix of food tangled in the raft, or just blind luck, they stepped onto sand that no primate had touched before. They were alone, cut off permanently from whatever population they'd come from. When you line up the odds, it seems almost absurd you can walk through a forest in Madagascar today and see their descendants. Statistically speaking, they shouldn't be here. No ships, no swimmers, no continent-hopping bridge, just one fluke crossing in the vast span of time, and it's stuck. Generations later, their DNA still carries the echo of that unlikely arrival. They didn't fight their way here, they drifted here, and the isolation did the rest. Everything that happened next is the product of that isolation. With no back-and-forth migrations to shuffle the gene pool, no new primate competitors sailing in, their population. So their arrival was the improbable beginning of a story we can still read in their bones and behavior. The world they stepped into was an empty theater where the predator's role had yet to be cast. And in that kind of stillness, where nothing hunted them and no rival species pushed them aside, evolution could take a very different path. It's one thing to survive against challenges you understand. It's another to adapt when there are no challenges at all, at least not the kind you're built for, which makes you wonder, what happens to a primate's instincts, its body, even its senses, when it spends millions of years never looking over its shoulder? What kind of animal does that create? The lemurs you see today, the sifakas, indris, mouse lemurs, all the familiar shapes, are survivors. They're what's left after most of their extended family disappeared. The fossil record in Madagascar shows us a very different scene than the one you'd see now in its forests. There were lemurs so big they'd stare you in the eye without climbing anything, and others with body shapes that don't fit neatly into the categories we know. In fact, if you lined up those extinct species with the living ones, you'd realize the modern lemurs are just a slim chapter in a much longer book. We know this because of bones found in caves, rock shelters, and old lake beds scattered across the island. Some are buried deep enough to be thousands of years old, but others are startlingly fresh, still showing texture and detail you wouldn't expect from fossils. That's a clue that the disappearances weren't an ancient slow fade. They happened recently in geological terms. Some species probably vanished within the last millennium or two, which, compared to the tens of millions of years lemurs have been here, is an abrupt ending. One that stands out in both the bones and the reconstructions is the giant sloth lemur, otherwise known as Archaeoindris, known for its awkward proportions. It had long, curved fingers and toes, a short snout, small eyes, and a body size comparable to a big chimp. It didn't look like a scaled-up version of any lemur you know. It looked like something designed for a very specific purpose, and then stranded in a world that moved on without it. Those hook-like limbs suggest it moved slowly, hanging under branches the way a sloth does now, probably feeding on leaves, fruits, and maybe seeds it could crack open with a powerful jaw. Imagine the gap between the tiny wide-eyed mouse lemur and this hulking creature. That's the range Madagascar once supported. The remains of other extinct lemurs give us variations just as strange. There were koala-like tree dwellers with short faces and massive chewing muscles, tailor-made for crushing tough vegetation. Others were semi-terrestrial, built for walking as much as climbing, maybe moving between forest patches for food. One massive lemur had long legs that hinted at leaping ability, but also a bulk that would have made it clumsy and don't galloping. These weren't oddballs, Physical remains tell only part of the story. Scientists also read the island's environmental history and other clues. Pollen grains preserved in layers of sediment from lakes and wetlands, for example. Each layer traps what the surrounding vegetation was like in the past. In drier periods, pollen from grasses and scrubland dominates. In wetter times, the record shifts toward rainforest trees. By matching the pollen record to the ages of lemur fossils in the same region, you can start to see which species lived through particular environmental shifts and which ones disappeared when the plant mix changed. Climate change in Madagascar hasn't been subtle over the last few tens of thousands of years. There were shifts toward longer dry seasons, contractions of rainforest habitat, and the spread of open woodlands in previously dense areas. That cut down not just the total space available, but the variety of food sources. For a giant sloth lemur that needed large, old trees and a steady supply of leaves and fruit, losing half its forest to fire, thinner canopy could be a devastating. Smaller, more generalist lemurs could switch diets. Large spaces public cave sediment add another layer of evidence. Some sheltered sites or amorphous wood buildings animals remain, preserved together with outside, even time. It's not always an easy view. It tells you that fire was present in the landscape, even when animals tamed, or later from human activity. In older layers, the steadiness is seen. Then suddenly certain monster acts, greater and that in the layers above. Sometimes those vanishings line up with periods of environmental stress or decline. Animals might have been decisions falling short. Other times, they have been doing relatively stable climbing. Things that are much faster to thrive in trees or softer nature. All of this blurs the world with a timeline. The larger animals tend to disappear first in periods of environmental strain. The smaller ones are picked up too, but they have sediment in their layers. When the climate swings harsh, gaps or shifting, when they severe, those things happen. In between, there are windows where new forms might appear. Monsters of the past may yet be innovating now. To fill in the gaps, they will seek out new habitats. Develop their giant size between dry-land islands that slow-moving arboreal fields or forests. Coastal areas might be preferred also. However, these cases, this is a rare event in Madagascar. It happens repeatedly, often triggered by changes in climate and vegetation. They give us all data for observing what vanished from the lemur group. Even more revealing is how recent some of these things were. Bones of giant lemurs have been found at sites marked from 2. That places their final centuries directly in the timeline of human presence. It tells us the natural story of climate and isolation is about to get spliced with a new storyline, one with fire-cleared forests, hunting, and animals brought in from overseas. In that combined picture, environmental stress doesn't always act alone. It works alongside direct human impacts to remove species faster than climate alone ever did. Looking back through this lens makes the lemurs you see now feel different. They're not the inevitable outcome of a closed system. They're the survivors of a system that has already been cut down from something bigger and stranger. The gaps between their body sizes, diets, and behaviors are filled in by shadows of things that no longer exist. And we might never get a perfect model of what that ancient balance looked like in motion. Just bones, pollen, and sediment set in layers. But the story those layers tell is unambiguous. Madagascar's lemurs have been shaped as much by disappearance as by adaptation. Every gap in the record marks a trait or an ecological role that is now gone from the living community. By the time we get into the more recent layers, the changes are quick, the losses sharper, and the traces of outside influence harder to ignore. Spend enough time with those fossils and the so-called pristine Madagascar of 1,000 years ago starts to look different. It wasn't untouched. It was already missing parts. And the pace of change was picking up. In the next phase of the record, the silence of those giant lemurs will be joined by others as human arrival folds into the natural history and sets a new rhythm for survival and extinction. With no other primates stealing their lunch, lemurs didn't just survive in Madagascar. They exploded into every feeding role the island's habitats could offer. On continents, primates often spend half the day in a tug-of-war over the same figs, leaves, or insects. Here, the entire menu was wide open. There was no baboon troop charging in to strip a tree, no macaques cutting in line to raid fruit. Every edible thing was theirs to try, and over time, different lemur species essentially staked out different tables in a sprawling all-you-can-eat buffet. This is what scientists call niche partitioning, though in Madagascar it happened without direct competition from other primates forcing fine divisions. Instead of battling close cousins over a single food source, early lemurs could settle into diets that were wildly different from one another. Some stayed generalists, taking whatever fruit, leaves, or bugs they found. Others specialized to the point where nearly their entire survival hinged on one type of food. Without a rival stealing from under them, they could refine their bodies to match their chosen menu in ways that, elsewhere, would have been a gamble. Take the bamboo lemur. It didn't just like bamboo, it evolved to eat varieties with cyanide levels that would poison most mammals. Its jaw muscles and teeth are tuned to crack and grind those fibrous stalks daily. And the really strange bit? They do it without any dramatic display of immunity. They aren't visibly armored against the plant's toxin. They just process it efficiently enough that the dose doesn't harm them. That's a slot no other primate even bothers to fill. Then there are the fruit eaters, like the black and white ruffed lemur. These aren't just forest foragers. They're one of the best seed dispersers in Madagascar's rainforests. They can swallow seeds that are too big for smaller lemurs and drop them far from the parent tree, effectively planting future forests as they go. On continents, that role is shared among monkeys, birds, and even bats. In Madagascar, they own the morning shift. Less competition means their foraging routes stretch as wide as the forest allows, and the plants themselves adapt to rely on them. On the other extreme, you have nectar feeders, lemurs with long muzzles and tongues designed to reach deep into flowers. The red-bellied lemur is one you'll see doing this, dusting its face in pollen as it drinks, basically acting as a primate pollinator. In most parts of the world, primates barely register as part of the pollination crew. In Madagascar, they can be key players between flowering plants and fertilization. It's a role you'd never expect from an animal also capable of smashing a beetle against bark and eating it whole. If you look closely at their mouths, those dietary divisions are built right into their anatomy. Lemurs share something called a tooth comb, where the lower front teeth are shaped like a row of grooming tools. This isn't just for cleaning each other's fur. In some species, it's used to scrape gum off tree bark or broom flowers for nectar. Jaw shapes vary too. Leaf-eating civetas have powerful chewing muscles and ridged molars ideal for shredding fibrous vegetation. Insect hunters tend to have sharper tusks for piercing exoskeletons. None of these features appear in identical form across all lemurs. They're tailored to the foods each species Lemurs can't count on their favorite meal every day of the year. That means species specialize will keep a backup menu. The bamboo lemur might snack on fruit when humans aren't there. Fruit specialists will eat young leaves or flowers from canopies or in ponds. This seasonal flexibility is why dozens of different species can overlap in the same stretch of forest without fighting each other out. It also makes their foraging patterns less predictable than we might suspect. The fruit feeding at ground level on flowers and the off-season might be twinkling every button in town, chasing fruit right where it rises. Those shifts mean they can crisscross ranges of other species without strangling each other's food supply. On continents, similar overlap usually leads to competing non-territorial fights. In Madagascar, it leads to a complex seasonal choreography, with some species overshadowing others to play test over or take advantage of this flexibility. Over evolutionary time, this peaceful sharing of space allowed an unusual number of species to pile into the same habitats. In a patch of rainforest the size of a city park, you could find upwards of a dozen lemur species, all eating different things in slightly different ways. Their variety isn't just a curiosity, it was one of the stabilizing forces in Madagascar's ecosystems. If one food source failed, another species could pick up the slack. If a plant needed its seeds carried far, chances were at least one lemur on the scene could handle the job. All this is easier to appreciate when you contrast it with primates in Asia or Africa, where rival species often keep each other in check. On the mainland, specializing too much on a single food source can be risky. Someone else might take it from under you, or the same predators that track your prey might target you. In Madagascar's isolation, the risk equation changed. You could get weird. You could gamble on an odd food source and bet there'd be no one else around to strip it. And when that gamble worked, it opened a whole new evolutionary lane. Before humans arrived, that web of different feeding strategies wasn't just stable, it was self-reinforcing. Different lemur species kept plants reproducing, prevented any one food source from being overexploited, and buffered each other against seasonal shortages. It was a kind of unspoken agreement written into their teeth, hands, and stomachs. No species needed to edge the others out entirely. There was enough variety and enough space in the schedule for everyone to keep their corner. What makes it striking is that this system held for millions of years without collapsing under its own weight. The same forests could keep their pollinators, seed dispersers, insect controllers, and leaf processors year after year, just rearranged by the seasons. And every new lemur species that emerged didn't have to replace an existing one. It could just claim a new slice of the menu. But all this diversity didn't just come from food habits alone. Madagascar's land itself, its climates, rivers, and mountains would keep splitting populations apart, forcing them to adapt again to slightly different conditions. Diet, geography, and isolation all work together, multiplying the variety you can still see today in forests, spiny thickets, and highland plateaus. The island wasn't just one vast buffet for lemurs. It was dozens of separate kitchens, each with its own menu and its own specialists. About 2,000 years ago, Madagascar's long, quiet run as an isolated world ended. The first human boats appeared on its shores, carrying people who had been at sea long enough to cross hundreds of miles of open water. Whether they came from Africa, Southeast Asia, or both, they brought more than just themselves. With them came fire, crops, new animals, and ways of using the land that didn't exist here before. For the first time since lemurs had arrived millions of years earlier, they weren't alone in shaping the island. The lemurs had never seen anything like humans. They had no evolutionary blueprint for dealing with a new predator that stood upright, moved deliberately, and could strike from a distance with tools. They weren't wired to view people as a threat. A ring-tailed lemur feeding in the open might glance up at an eagle, but it had no reason to worry about a soft-footed hunter closing in with a spear. This gap in their instincts made them vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with size, strength, or stamina. The calm behavior that had served them so well for millions of years was now a liability. The earliest human settlements didn't sprawl over the whole island. They clustered near coasts and rivers, where fishing and farming were easiest. From there, people began cutting and burning the surrounding vegetation to make space for crops. Slash-and-burn agriculture wasn't new in the world, but here it started carving into habitats that had been stable for centuries. Once burned, this land often shifted to grassland or thin scrub, which couldn't support the same diversity of plants or animals. Fire was only part of the change. Along with crop seeds came domesticated animals, dogs, pigs, and zebu cattle among them. These animals grazed in open areas, rooted through undergrowth, and competed with native wildlife for space and resources. They also came with their own impacts, trampling seedlings, eroding soil, and in some cases, eating the same plants certain lemur species depended on. For an ecosystem that had evolved without large hoofed grazers, these newcomers added an entirely new disturbance. The lemurs faced the other, more direct problem: hunting. Archaeological digs on Madagascar have turned up ancient middens, essentially old refuse heaps, containing lemur bones alongside the remains of fish, birds, and other animals. Some of these bones bear cut marks, clear signs they'd been butchered. The dates on these middens often fall within the last couple of thousand years, placing human hunting squarely in the timeline of recent extinctions. It doesn't take much imagination to picture how it happened. A species used to predators attacking only from the air or from ambush had no defense against a coordinated group of humans. Slow-moving giants like the sloth lemurs would have been the easiest targets. Unlike climate change or natural habitat shifts, which can stretch across centuries or millennia, human pressure works on a different clock. A lemur population might be reduced in a single season of intense hunting. Combine that with habitat loss from fire and the effect compounds. Smaller and more isolated populations become more vulnerable, and breeding rates, already slow in many lemur species, can't keep up with the losses. Once numbers drop below a certain level, recovery becomes almost impossible, especially if the surviving fragments of forest can't support enough individuals to make a genetically healthy population. Some areas would have felt this change sooner than others. Near settlement sites, hunting pressure and land clearing could push lemurs out entirely within a few generations. Farther inland or in less accessible forests, the pressures would come later, but by then, the damage had already begun in the more connected parts of their range. The very landscape that had encouraged speciation through isolation now worked against them. A lemur species tied to one patch of habitat could vanish locally, and with no corridor to recolonize from, that was the end of it there. Even species that weren't heavily targeted for food suffered from the indirect effects. Fire didn't only remove feeding trees, it could alter the composition of plants in a way that didn't suit certain diets. If you're a lemur that depends on specific fruiting trees, and those trees die without regeneration, you're left with either switching to a less nutritious or less digestible food, or moving into unfamiliar territory where you might not compete as well. Over time, these pressures lead to population decline even without direct hunting. Some human practices may have struck harder during certain seasons. Clearing land in the dry season, when food sources were already scarcer, would have added extra stress on lemurs trying to store energy or prepare for breeding. Hunting at this time could remove individuals at their weakest point, further reducing recovery odds. These tactical advantages for humans translated into steep disadvantages for species that didn't recognize or anticipate them. By the time the pattern was spreading across the island, the large lemurs were already gone or pushed into extreme rarity. The smaller, faster-breeding species fared better, but even they could only adapt so far. Many retreated into the shrinking pockets of untouched forest, relying on their generalist diets or nocturnal habits to avoid further conflict. Others persisted in degraded habitats, surviving on suboptimal food or altered routines. The archaeological record suggests this shift from abundance to absence didn't happen evenly. Some regions hung on to more species for centuries after others had emptied out. This unevenness makes sense given Madagascar's size and varied terrain. Remote corners and rugged interiors act as refuges, buying time for the species inside them. But over the long term, these scattered safe zones couldn't stand against the combined forces of expansion, agriculture, and hunting. When you step back, the arrival of humans rewrote the lemurs' situation in a few quick moves. A safe, predator-free world became one where the most dangerous predator was intelligent, widespread, and altering the environment at the same time. Hunting removed individuals faster than reproduction could replace them. Fire reshaped plant communities and shrank the amount of viable habitat. Imported animals added competition and new pressures. And the isolation that had once protected Madagascar's lemurs from outside forces now meant there was no reinforcements, no migration from elsewhere to make up the losses. The pace matters here. Evolution works on hundreds of generations. Human impact can register in one. A lemur could be born into a stable forest, raise its own offspring there, and in the span of a few reproductive cycles, see that same forest cut or burned, its species hunted, and its population fragmented beyond repair. For a creature whose lineage stretches back tens of millions of years, the new timetable was catastrophic. And yet, for all the losses, the lemurs weren't erased entirely. Some found refuge in forests too remote or rugged for early settlement. Others managed to adjust enough to hang on, switching foods or shifting their habits to avoid humans. A few even survived near human presence, perhaps tolerated, perhaps overlooked. However reduced, their persistence is proof that the full story of their evolution didn't end when people arrived. It just changed direction. You can still see traces of their deep past in their behavior and anatomy, reminders of a time before the island's long isolation was finally broken. These animals carry another kind of meaning, one woven into culture. In Malagasy tradition, a lemur isn't just an animal moving through the forest. It can be a spirit, an ancestor, or an omen, depending on who you ask and where on the island you are. That means when people see one, they aren't necessarily thinking about biology or conservation. They might be thinking about who in their family has passed, what luck might be coming their way, or what rules they need to follow to avoid trouble. For people whose lives have always been tied to the rhythms of the land, animals are rarely just animals. Lemurs have been in their world for thousands of years, and over that time, the way they are seen has built layers of meaning as varied as the species themselves. In some regions, certain lemurs are linked directly to human ancestors. It's not a poetic statement, it's literal in belief. The idea might be that a particular lemur species carries the spirit of people from a clan or village. Seeing one isn't just seeing wildlife, it's meeting a relative. In those areas, you wouldn't think about harming that animal any more than you would think about harming a family member. That connection can feel less like superstition and more like a rule as solid as land boundaries or inheritance lines. The forest isn't just a backdrop, it's a place where the living and the dead are part of the same community. Other species are more complicated traits in local traditions. They might be viewed That variability means lemurs' safety under cultural protection is a patchwork. In some places, species have been shielded for generations by strong fadi that forbid harming them. In others, no such rule exists, and there's nothing stopping hunting or habitat disturbance except logistics and opportunity. Cultural beliefs, just like wildlife laws, can be more effective in some regions than in others. The difference is that fadi doesn't need government enforcement. Compliance comes from within the community. There are stories tied to specific species that go beyond general rules. A certain kind of lemur might be said to have saved a person in the past, leading to a ban on harming it ever since. Another might be thought of as vengeful if killed, bringing sickness to the perpetrator. These tales aren't interested in scientific accuracy. They're a mix of history, warning, and moral lesson, kept alive because they reinforce the boundary between what's acceptable and what's dangerous, whether that danger is physical, spiritual, or social. This cultural layer has worked as a kind of unplanned conservation strategy, sometimes protecting lemurs more effectively than formal wildlife laws. A lemur species falling under a local taboo might thrive in one region, even if it's declining everywhere else. The people following the fadi don't have to think about biodiversity for it to work, they just follow the rule. It's a side effect of tradition that gives the lemur room to survive, but the reverse can also be true. If a species is tied to a negative association, the cultural rule might encourage avoiding it in ways that don't help it survive. Avoiding is harmless if it means leaving the lemur alone entirely. It's more complicated if the animal is seen as dangerous to crops, or if its presence is believed to bring bad outcomes in other ways. In those situations, fear can push people to drive the animal away from certain areas, and if that overlaps with the valuable habitat, it can shrink the space the lemur has to live in. Modern changes in Madagascar also shift how these beliefs hold up. As people move for work or settle in new places, they bring their ideas with them, but they also encounter different sets of rules. That can result in blending traditions, dropping some, or adopting new ones. The fadi that protected a species for centuries in one place might not mean much in another region, especially if local history there doesn't support it. Over time, that can erode the cultural shield that tradition alone once provided. There's also the role of younger generations. While many still know the stories and rules, the influence of schools, media, and outside economies can change how much those traditions anchor daily life. A fadi that was absolute in a grandparent's lifetime might become more of a suggestion in a grandchild's. That shift can open the door to behaviors that were unthinkable just a few decades earlier, especially if economic pressure or food scarcity is involved. It's easy to put cultural protection and formal conservation in the same box, but they aren't the same thing. Conservation is goal-driven, measured in population numbers and habitat maps. Cultural protection is deeper in the fabric of daily life, but it doesn't operate with species recovery in mind. It can help or hurt without ever intending to do either. The overlap is a coincidence, not the plan. The strength of fadi is also its limitation. It works without written laws, but it can't guarantee coverage everywhere, and it wasn't designed to respond to sudden changes in population or habitat. For lemurs, this mixed legacy means their relationship with people is layered. The same species might be a sacred ancestor in one forest, hunted in another, and ignored in a third. A conservation plan that ignores that is incomplete, so is one that assumes all traditions will work in a species' favor. You can't talk about lemur survival without talking about the cultures that share space with them, because even without direct action, the rules people live by shape the lemur's chances, and those rules are as vulnerable to change as any forest. Economic needs, migration, and shifts in belief systems can dismantle protections that took hundreds of years to build. On the other hand, respect for tradition can be a stable platform for preserving species, especially when it works alongside scientific management, where beliefs treat a lemur as part of the community. Its survival is bound up with the survival of the people's way of life. That's a connection much harder to replace than a legal code, and much harder to rebuild once it's gone. In Madagascar, the line between nature and culture has never been strict. Forests, rivers, animals, and spirits all share the same mental map, and lemurs fit into that map in more than one way. They're part of the ecosystems that sustain life and part of the social and spiritual systems that explain it. That means their future isn't just a question of forests and food. It's also a question of which stories are still told, which rules are still followed, and which beliefs can adapt without breaking. You could strip away all the scientific data and still see that relationship in how some people react to a lemur crossing their path. Whether that moment is seen as a blessing, a warning, or nothing at all depends on layers of meaning that go back far beyond living memory. And in places where those meanings are still strong, they can preserve a lemur's place in the world without anyone having to name it as conservation. Which brings us to the quiet yet fragile present. Lemurs now hold a title no one wants. They're the most endangered group of mammals on Earth. Not one species, not a handful. The group as a whole. If you stacked all the threats against them, old and new, you'd see why their odds are this bad. Habitat loss wears the biggest crown in that lineup. Madagascar's forests aren't being chipped away slowly over centuries anymore. They're being taken out in big, fast bites. Timber gets cut for building or sold off entirely, and land is cleared for crops like rice, cassava, and vanilla. A forest that took centuries to build can be gone in a week, replaced by open dirt and the slow advance of grass and scrub. And once the canopy goes, you can't just glue it back together. Hunting never stopped either. For some families, lemurs are simply meat. For others, they're taken to be sold as bushmeat in markets. It's not just remote villages. It's urban demand too. If there's money in a carcass, there's incentive to take it, even if it's illegal. In some cases, pet trade plays a role. Young lemurs caught and sold as entertainment or status symbols. The adults they came from are often killed in the process. That part of the trade isn't cute. It's a straight population drain. And then there's climate pressure. Madagascar's climate already swings between wet and dry seasons, but now the cycles are shifting harder and faster. Droughts last longer, wet seasons don't deliver as much rain, and extreme weather can knock an already fragile patch of forest into outright collapse. Food sources dry up or fruit out of season. If you're a lemur built for a particular feeding routine tied to a flowering calendar, moving underneath, moving forest, you have a future as patient and pace. The good part is the adaptation that every human mammal towards big eyes, a toxin-resistant gut can't digest forage food if the tree it grew on is now half. Lifespan and slowly adjusting makes sense in a predator system. Are anchors in a world that demands quick recovery. You can't double your numbers in 3 seasons when you only have one infant at a time, and you raise it for months before it's independent. That's not a strategy. This has pushed conservation into a mode that's part emergency work, part long-term thinking. On the science side, there are protected areas, national parks, reserves, community-managed forests, where habitat destruction is restricted or banned. Researchers track populations, plant corridors to connect isolated forest patches, and study feeding and breeding habits to understand what each species needs to survive. captive breeding for some species is more of a safety net than a solution. It keeps a genetic line alive in case the wild population collapses entirely. It's not ideal, but the alternative is extinction without a backup. But science on its own doesn't cut it here, because you can't fence conservation off from the realities of the people living alongside the lemurs. This is where community-driven projects step in. Some work on giving locals a direct stake in keeping forests standing, like sustainable harvest programs for vanilla or wild silk that depend on trees remaining healthy. Others tap into the cultural layer, using fadey and traditional respect for certain species as a foundation for modern protection. A sifaka that's untouchable because of a local taboo gets the same benefit from that belief as it would from an international treaty, and the enforcement is much closer to home. There are also community patrols, people trained and paid to monitor forest areas, keep an eye out for illegal cutting or hunting, and work as a link between villages and conservation groups. For families, this can mean a stable income that doesn't rely on clearing new farmland, which relieves pressure on the forest from another angle. Education campaigns in schools aim to keep younger generations aware of what's at stake, tying the survival of lemurs to local pride as much as to scientific arguments. Still, the pace of loss is heavy. Even well-protected reserves are only as safe as their boundaries. If the land around them is stripped, the forest edge dries out, animal movements get cut off, and the protected patch becomes an island. Isolated populations inside it are more vulnerable to disease, inbreeding, and simple bad luck from storms or fire. Creating corridors between these green islands is slow work. Trees take years to mature, and funding isn't endless. The math is blunt. If a species is losing more habitat and individual care than it gains, the curve only points down. Some naturally without intervention now. This isn't speculation. It's very observation. Lemurs have lived in Madagascar for millions of years, shaped by the island's gentle isolation. But that same isolation means they have nowhere else to go if the forests fade or the climate shifts too far. The changes come quietly. A patch of trees gone here, a family missing there, so slowly that it can seem like nothing is wrong, until it is. Protecting them isn't about sudden rescues or dramatic scenes. It's about keeping the forest green, letting the rivers flow, and making sure each new season has a safe place for tiny hands to grip the branches. Sometimes it means focusing on the rarest species. Other times it's about helping whole habitats recover. Even tourism, which brings visitors and funds, can change in an instant when the world throws a storm. Through it all, lemurs remain woven into Madagascar's story. To lose them would be to lose a piece of the island's soul and millions of years of life's memory. Keeping them here is not just a gift for the lemurs, it's a quiet promise to the future, made while their songs still echo in the trees.